All right, hey everybody. This is Dr. Jacob Mills. We have a treat for you today. We are going to be talking to him about Marcus Aurelius and meditations and Stoicism. Dr. Mills has a PhD from Rice University. He is also a fellow faculty member here at Houston Community College in the philosophy department. He specializes in early modern philosophies, and he has graciously joined us today to talk about Stoicism. So how are you doing, Dr. Mills?
I'm doing really fantastic. How are you guys doing?
I'm doing awesome, man. So let's talk about Marcus Aurelius and meditation. So one of the things that I want to talk, the first thing I want to talk about, I think, is defining Stoicism, because it's one of those words that you hear kind of in just conversations, with people. And one of the things that I find interesting about this book is that, to me, it provides a much more expansive definition of Stoicism than what I think people often view as being Stoic. Right? So in the book, there's a quote where he says, Stoicism is to always be the same in sharp pains, on the occasion of the loss of a child, and in long illness. So the idea of like burying these problems, right? Is this accurate? Is this like a holistic definition of Stoicism, or how would you define it?
Yeah, oh, that's a really good question. Yeah, so in Stoicism, I feel like there's a bunch of isms that come out in the classical Greek philosophy. There's Stoicism, Epicureanism, skepticism, and even cynicism. And these are all heirs of Socrates in one way or another. I mean, they all think that they're carrying on the flag of Socrates, even though they're doing it in different ways. And Stoicism, I think that constancy that you described in the quote is a very good way of understanding it. It's somehow like the Socratic dictum, know thyself. It's about knowing what you really are, and everything else is, I suppose, in a way, supposed to flow out of that knowledge.
Okay.
Knowing what you truly are inside of yourself.
It's interesting because I actually wrote that down as a note to myself that it is very. I think Socrates is sometimes attributed with the know thyself idea, but it was like written on a temple. I can't remember where in ancient Greece.
Yeah, the temple at Delphi.
Right. Yeah. And see, this is why you bring kids. This is why you bring a scholar in to know these things. But there's another quote in Meditations where he says, "It remains then for you to understand among what kind of workmen you place yourself," which is essentially like you got to know what you want to do, right? You have to know yourself in order to kind of achieve, what I guess like Buddha would call like enlightenment, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting concept, but I think there are problems though with Stoicism.
Okay.
We might get to some of those here.
Yeah.
Okay, so like one of the things that struck me the most about Meditations and a lot of it, particularly I think the first half of the book, seems to deal a lot with notions of fate and what life has in store for you as a person. And there's a lot of different ways that he talks about this. What is your take on that? What kind of role do you think fate plays for these kind of ancient philosophers?
I mean, for the Stoics, it's huge. So this idea of a kind of balance between internal and external, or freedom and what you have control over, and fate and necessity or determinism, those kind of get confused. Those are related concepts, but might be slightly different. Like what the modal status of this necessity is, of the causal chain. They also call this providence, right? So this is how they interpret God's providence, right? So it's not clear whether it's like God looking out for stuff or it's just the causal order of the universe.
Right, because certainly the ancient Romans and the Greeks believed that God's played an active role, right?
That's right. And I think Marcus Aurelius interprets it in that stronger sense of God. There's not just a causal order, but it's a rational order as well. Whereas different Stoics kind of or they kind of ride the fence on that, like whether it's also a kind of moral rational order, or if it's just more of a causal order. But knowing those two things, I think, is the key to this kind of Stoic detachment that you were describing originally, right? Like you're supposed to understand what's in your control and what's not. And if it's not in your control, if it's part of fate, if it's part of providence, you let it go.
Yeah.
You let it go.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
No. So I have a quote. Like I love quotes. So I always encourage students, to use quotes from the book, to help form arguments. And obviously as scholars, we use primary sources to help form arguments. And like there's this quote where he says, "There remains that which is peculiar to the good man, to be pleased and content with what happens, and with the thread that is spun for him," which is, wow, it's great prose. He says, "A man out to come pure, tranquil, ready to depart, and without any compulsion, perfectly reconciled to his lot." And so he's basically just saying you got to be happy with what life. It's essentially when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade, right?
That's right.
You essentially just be happy with it.
Or you just eat lemons, right?
Right, yeah. I mean, that's essentially part of it, right? Is even in the book, he's like, if terrible things are happening to you, you just got to accept it.
That's right.
There are some, I have some problems with this, though, in a way.
Sure.
Because sometimes, like, he even hand waves away people's concerns, like, kind of out of hand. He's like, maybe you're dissatisfied with your lot in life. And even at one point in the book, he says, wipe out the imagination. Stop pulling on the strings. Confine yourself to the present. And I think that's a really fascinating thing, because if I'm reading it correctly, what he's essentially saying is that yearning for something will make you unhappy.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, or at least it has the possibility of making you unhappy, right? Because you might not get it. Or
sure,
if you get it, it might be taken away from you. And in fact, it will be taken away from you ultimately by either its death or your death, or, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it's always reminded me, like, I always go back to like science fiction, like Star Trek, like Spock is like the ultimate, I guess, stoic, maybe in a kind of certain
both
sense.
in temperament and in ideas, I think, right?
Yeah. Or at least maybe that's one sort of stereotype of it. But yeah, it's like here's I guess maybe to put my finger on, I guess maybe your worry is that, right, you give up a lot of good stuff, quote unquote, maybe, to follow the Stoic lifestyle. So it's like, yes, it promises you this kind of freedom and this kind of tranquility and this kind of enlightenment or something like that.
Sure.
But it's kind of like Buddhism in that sense. Like, what else do you have to give up? All desires?
Yeah, it's like when you read this, it almost comes across as like a very bleak outlook. That he's, it's almost, and I've heard some people say that that sometimes it comes across very like Jesus Christ-like, where it's like kind of cast off your other things and come follow me, sort of. Obviously, he's not telling people to follow him, but more so like cast off your desires and your wishes and just like be satisfied with, and a lot of that satisfaction is in here, right? It's internal rather than like external things.
It's in your, what's in your control is the judgments you make about things.
Right.
And so, if you're driving down the road and someone cuts you off and you're like, oh, you bastard or something like that, right? Whatever, right? Like, look at you. You're causing yourself pain and stress. Whereas, or if you like, I stubbed my toe the other day really badly. It's like, but if I make a judgment, it's like, look, that's just my body. It's not really me. And this is interesting, right? It's like, you have to really identify yourself with an immortal soul or something like that, or something. They talk about it, the daimon inside of you,
right?
Or this
the guiding force of reason.
That's right. It's the same thing that Socrates does during the Apology. He says, look, these guys can't hurt me. Even if they're about to put me to death, they can't hurt me. And it's foreign to us because we don't think that. Even though we are familiar with this concept of an immortal soul, for the Greeks it was something fairly new, and they identified themselves as an immortal soul. We don't even culturally do that. We think that we're kind of a body and a soul. And then maybe
I was about to say, because like for when you read it from a modern lens, it comes across as like this detachment, right?
That's
from like body and soul almost.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting point, that for us in the modern day, we conceive of ourselves as both like a mortal coil and then also something else.
We're gonna freak out if we lose a finger. For the Stoics, like the true Stoic, they would be like, that's just a finger.
Yeah. Okay, so here's one of my problems though with Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius is the emperor.
Yes.
He's a man with ultimate agency. He has the ultimate power in Roman society. So isn't it like a little condescending or even paradoxical and probably hypocritical to like just tell other people like be happy with your lot in life?
Yes it is. Yes it is. It's good to be the king, right? And so it's very easy for the king or the emperor in this case to say everything's where it should be from my perspective.
Yeah, he's like, this is all great.
That's
Like,
right. Yeah, and if Marcus Aurelius was the only living embodiment of skepticism, I would say that was true. But there are other writers on
hmm
Stoicism. Epictetus is one of my. I actually like Epictetus more than Marcus Aurelius,
hmm
but he was a slave and lived the Stoic life, and so
hmm
did many others that didn't write. So yes, that's a criticism of Marcus Aurelius, maybe, but not Stoicism. I don't think it Stoicism is a living possibility,
Right.
even if
So
you don't
so you're saying like this is a critique that is applicable to Marcus Aurelius, but maybe not everybody else, because
That's right.
yeah, because Marcus Aurelius is the king, right, and so or the emperor, and so he's going to be privileged in a way that a lot of people are not.
That's right.
So on one hand, Marcus Aurelius, kind of continuing on with this idea of fate, he talks about, and I'm going to use that term even though that may not be the best term here, but he says kind of to be content with your fate, to be content with your lot in life, but also in the sense that you have a duty to order your life. Is that a paradoxical idea, and does Stoicism chafe against the notion of free will?
So I have always thought that it does. So if I hear you correctly, what you're saying, isn't there this paradox of if everything is governed by fate and necessity, but yet you're supposed to be free?
Mm-hmm.
Like, weren't you determined to make the choices that you made, including choosing stoicism versus not choosing?
Yeah, exactly. Like free will, like the concept that like you have agency, and in some cases he seems to say like you do have agency, but in other times maybe not.
Yes, I have felt this tension kind of between free will and determinism within
Mm-hmm.
Stoicism, and I wish I knew had a better answer for you
Mm-hmm.
what to say here. Um,
Do you think they felt that tension?
I don't know that they did. I think that the ancient Greek thought was still very much trying to sort of formulate these problems.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they did have a robust debate within the ancient world
Mm-hmm.
about the free will determinism tension.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was alive, but there were certain moves that we looking back on now recognize as kind of maybe unclear about certain things, right? Weren't keeping certain concepts
Mm-hmm.
distinct.
Well, and
So
this is even a problem that if you go forward, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, the especially being a scholar of like early modern philosophies, this is a tension in Christianity as well. The
yeah,
idea that you have free will to
right.
accept right Jesus Christ is a very like Baptist and Methodist thing, whereas the Puritans would say, nope, there is no acceptance. Right? It is either it is fated. God has decided for you.
Before you even
Mm-hmm.
lived, right? Before you even were the concepts of reward or
Mm-hmm.
just, like it's not based on anything you've done yet. It's
Mm-hmm.
just pure preordination, right? Or
Right.
something like
And
that.
so even like so this is something that we don't just we see this kind of maybe not hypocrisy but perhaps a paradox, or at least as you put it, a tension between the idea of determinism, that things are determined to happen, and free will. We see that in Christianity too, all over the place, especially if you look at the history of it through various kind of groups and ideas. This seems to be like a central tension, perhaps like just a philosophical tension that has kind of like lingered through the years.
Yeah. It's a real thing, and I don't know what to do with it. I mean, there are kind of standard moves that people can make and say, well, your actions are part of the causal
Right.
order,
Yeah, yeah. Kind of try to
but
split the
that
middle.
they're trying to split it down the middle. This kind of notion of what's usually called compatibilism.
Mm-hmm.
But even then, it's like, how satisfying is that? Because even though your actions are part of the causal order, so it
Yeah.
says, you know,
That's
this is gonna happen, and it's determined to happen, but only because you did it.
that's really fascinating. The idea of splitting the middle, and I don't know. I remember the word you just used, but it reminds me a lot of hearing people argue about science and evolution versus creationism,
Mm-hmm.
because there will be people who will say, well, why can't both exist simultaneously? Why didn't God just create the science that then creates evolution, right? Like, why
Yeah,
isn't that
that they're
possible?
compatible.
Right, yeah, compatibilism, I think, is the word you used. And, like, that's a really fascinating idea because, is that a satisfying answer to everybody? And certainly it's not, right? There are a lot of people who fall on the firm sides of it, like, no, it's just creation and this is the way it is, or no, it's just evolution and there is no
That's right.
divine order.
That's right.
which I think is
And what it amounts down to is, at least with compatibilism, what you end up having to do is redefine free will. And you have to redefine it in such a way that it doesn't necessarily match with people's intuitions of what free will is going in. And so the people that are dissatisfied with that aren't happy with compatibilism. And then the people that are happy with compatibilism they say, well, your concept of free will is what's causing the problem. Get rid of it. And it's that kind of tension.
That's really interesting. And in both cases with like Christianity and with Marcus Aurelius, the idea of free will, though, it gives you the mechanism by which to find your own personal salvation, right? Like that Marcus Aurelius is saying, if you order your life in the correct way, you will achieve kind of like this mental enlightenment, so to speak. And in Christianity, it's like if you choose the right path, free will, you will find eternal salvation. So it's kind of like the same sort of idea.
Yeah, but I would actually disagree with you a little bit there, right?
Okay.
So I think that in Christianity and other doctrines, it's very much get the will right, get the behavior right, and enlightenment follows. I think to understand Stoicism, it reverses. It's the mental thing that happens first, and then the behavior follows.
Okay, I could see that.
Because
that's interesting.
It's about getting the ideas right. So one of the things that he's really emphasizes in here is something called it comes from Socrates as well. People call it moral rationalism, moral intellectualism or ethical intellectualism.
Explain what that is, because I'm not even that familiar with it.
Socratic intellectualism. It's the idea that no one willingly chooses the bad. Everybody wills the good.
Yeah.
So when people do bad things, and this is part of knowing who you're around, when people do bad things, they actually think it's good. So no one would eat dog poo, right? If you walked down the street and you saw someone eating dog poo, you would say, okay, well, they must not understand what that is. Like
right.
they don't understand something correctly. And so what it follows that for ethical behavior, all you have to do is get the right concept of what the good is. And once you have that, you will act on it. Why? Because who in the hell would choose the bad?
Right.
Knowing.
So Marcus Aurelius actually says something about that in Book 9. He says, injustice is impiety. And indeed, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here, or at least like condensing. He says, and indeed, he who pursues pleasure as good and avoids pain as evil is guilty of impiety. And I just have to hard disagree with that. Because isn't that just the nature of humanity, to try to avoid the things that will harm you and embrace the things that you view as pleasurable and good? And I guess, why is that seen as a negative in this context?
I don't know. I'd have to read the passage again. He says, if you pursue pleasure, say it again.
Yeah, I'll have to hold on. I just shut it. He says, and indeed, he who pursues pleasure as good and avoids pain as evil is guilty of impiety. And he goes further and says, for of necessity such a man must often find fault with the universal nature, alleging that it assigns things to bad and the good contrary to their deserts. And I think what he's trying to say here is that, like, maybe the pursuit of pleasure can lead you down wrong paths, perhaps. It's a fascinating thing, because when I read that, I was like, well, obviously everybody's going to try to do the things that will or to take advantage, or not take advantage of, but just engage in the things that they enjoy, so to speak, or that they view as pleasurable.
Yeah. Socrates, again, I keep on going back to Socrates.
That's always good.
In the Republic has this really kind of simple argument for why you might think that pleasure isn't the good. And I've always kind of been drawn to it. He just says, look, pleasure can't be the good because there are good and bad pleasures. And if you admit that there are good and bad pleasures, then I think you're forced to say, well, it's not pleasure that's the good. Certain pleasures might be good, but pleasure isn't the good.
Interesting.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, that actually kind of brings me to a topic I wanted to touch on, which is one of the things that you find all throughout meditations is the idea of temperance. The idea of kind of abstaining from certain things because it's healthy for your mind, right? So I love this quote right here where he says, do the external things that fall upon you distract you, right? Are you distracted? And he says, give yourself time to learn something new and good and cease to be whirled around, but then you must also avoid being carried around the other way. So essentially saying like if you're drawn to something, indulge for a moment, but then be willing to like pull back, right?
Right.
Don't let it control you. And
That's right.
it seems like he's talking about vices here, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, this notion that's probably being translated as temperance is a bad translation, in my opinion, of this thing called sophrosune in Greek, and temperance, because temperance has this kind of like be chaste,
Yeah.
don't ever engage.
It's
in
a very
pleasure.
moralistic
Yeah, like a teetotaler or something.
Yeah,
like
absolutely. No alcohol, right? Especially in the United States, that's what we think of.
That's right. No alcohol. And of course, that stuff is foreign to the Greek thought, right? Because they don't have a notion of an afterlife where you get to engage in all these things forever or something like that. Pleasure, happiness is supposed to be achieved here in this life, not in some afterlife where all the debts are reckoned, so to speak.
Right.
And so what a better translation for this word is something like self-control. Because it applies not to just physical things; it applies to mental stuff too. Well, someone that's hard-headed is not right. If they don't follow where the argument goes or where reason leads, they're exhibiting a lack of self-control.
Yeah,
or a lack of temperance or moderation.
Clear, temperance is a word that I used. That was just the word that came to my mind whenever I was reading this. That's not necessarily what the author wrote, but that's just the way that it kind of struck me as this idea of being a temperate person, of kind of like controlling urges, so to speak.
Yeah.
And very much the Marcus Aurelius, and you very much get that sense of what you're talking about, the idea that you need to live the life that you've been given in a way, right? He says, like, don't act as if you're going to live forever. Death is constantly shadowing you, so you must, like, be good while you have the time to do so, right? And so it's this idea that I think it's interesting that you put it that way, that they don't really believe in an afterlife, so you got to order yourself here, so and because you're not going to get anything after this life, right? This is the one.
This is the chance, and every moment, and every quote unquote bad thing or obstacle that comes in your way is really an opportunity for is the way they oftentimes talk about it, right? It's an opportunity to practice your stoicism.
And the translator did use the word temperance once, and it's in a sense where he says the quote is that he says, "I see no virtue that is opposed to justice, but I see a virtue that is opposed to love of pleasure, and that is temperance." And so he very clearly makes this juxtaposition between temperance and like kind of abstinence from things that you might enjoy, and further goes that the mind that is free from passions is a citadel. But I think that's also just part of the larger Marcus Aurelius idea of trying to be content with the life that you've been given, right? At least that's how it strikes me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is small enough to where you can kind of put it in your pocket. I mean, if you're ever traveling or the airport, right? Any place where you're stressed out and feel out of control is an opportunity to read your Marcus Aurelius and practice your stoicism.
It's true. Like I definitely highlighted passages in here that that I thought were helpful for just people living in the modern age, where there's like a lot of stressors and there's a lot of we live in a very chaotic time period, and sometimes you read this stuff and you're like, yeah, like I should focus on only the things that I can control, right? I can't control a lot of things in this world. And he talks a lot about death in this book as well. And, and at one point he makes this lovely analogy where he says that basically time is like a river. He even calls it like a violent river. And that basically what we're seeing now will soon be carried away by the river. And then what comes later will also be carried away. And so he's basically like, look, you got to take advantage of your time because it's going to be swept away. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really fascinating. And he also urges people to not, to avoid like pursuit of fame in this life in a way, because he's like, it doesn't matter. And if we're all going to be dead soon, essentially.
That's right.
Which I think is really interesting.
And all memories, right, will be faded away, right? There's no afterlife. There's no like recording, right, where it's like your personality is etched somewhere forever. That's not what happens,
right?
I mean, they're not. He. I don't know that they're exactly clear on it, but I mean, I get the sense that whatever your soul is or whatever, right? That doesn't last long, and that gets recycled into the universal reason or something like that. Like
Mm-hmm.
you join with your father or your mother or whatever you want to call it, but it's not any kind of personal immortality that's preserved.
Mm-hmm. One of the
The
things,
energy is recycled or something like that.
right? Like, yeah, the circle of life, Lion King type thing, right?
Yeah.
The Greeks would often use this word arete, right, to describe like excellence, this moral virtue, this virtuous person, and that everybody should kind of strive to be the best version of whatever it is that they can or should be. Do you think that Marcus Aurelius like abides by this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this notion that art, developing arete, developing virtue, developing excellence this is the key to how the ancient Greeks thought about ethics.
Mm-hmm.
Developing arete and excellence or virtue was the means to get to happiness.
Mm-hmm.
What's translated from eudaimonia, which is like the goal state.
Okay.
And again, it's not salvation. It's not in another life. It's here in this life.
Mm.
And it gets translated as happiness, but a better translation is something like a flourishing life. And maybe think of it as enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
I think they talk about it as like literally like the spirit within you is good or is well intentioned.
Yeah, it almost like again, to reference like the Buddha, right? Like that sense of nirvana, like internally almost.
That's right.
Yeah,
Because literally the word eu in the Greek is like a prefix that means like doing well,
mm-hmm.
and then daimonia it's where our word demon comes from, daimon.
Right.
But for the Greeks, it just meant like an angel, like a spirit, like something in between human and divine. And so it's like they thought that each of us had this kind of divine spark,
right,
or guardian spirit or something like that in us, and that knowing thyself
mm-hmm.
was knowing that that's who you really were. And
right.
so all of your goal is to cultivate that.
With the diamond, is this something? The way that I kind of looked at it is that it's the kind of like the conscience that lives within you, but at the same time you kind of can cultivate it, right? Like it struck me in a way that even though you have this diamond, this soul, so to speak, that over your life you can kind of like cultivate it and make it, as you would put, more healthy perhaps, or like try to achieve enlightenment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's you can think of it as conscience. I think of it's more along the line of like the Greek Orthodox notion of apotheosis, that
Okay.
you can become like God, all right? And even in the New Testament, in the Gospels, this is kind of here, right? That
Mm-hmm.
we can all be brothers and children of God and stuff like that. And
Right.
so it's this notion that you've got a spark of the divine in you, and what
mm-hmm.
you ought to do, or the goal of life, is to sort of cultivate this spark.
Right. That's also a very Christian concept. Like, obviously, that goes back before Christianity, right? But part of the like the basis of Christian philosophy is the idea that man came from God and has literal, as you would put, like a fleck of the divine in
That's
them.
right.
And so
Right.
that's really fascinating that when you study religions and philosophies, you see these ideas go from the Greeks to the Romans, like into the Christian church, obviously, which was created kind of during the Roman era. And so it's like, oftentimes I think people maybe look at Christianity as like a standalone, but it's not, right? It's in conversation with the things that are happening.
Got a history.
Yeah, absolutely.
It borrows, right? And this is what's interesting, right? What you're seeing here is the development of what we would call the immortal soul.
Right.
And we take it for granted. The Greeks didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you look at Homer, right, those dudes didn't have immortal souls. Those dudes all went to Hades, no matter if you were the best of people or the worst of people.
Yeah.
Everybody went to Hades. And the things that were in Hades, in the underworld, weren't souls. They were like ghosts.
Yeah, it was like ghostly things.
Right. They weren't really the personality. And so, the concept of an immortal soul is a kind of cognitive technology, and it takes work. It takes generations of people and practices to sort of get people thinking in terms of this. And that's what you're seeing. And it happens in the Greek thought through these mystery cults that happen, like the Eleusinian mystery cults.
Right.
Or the perfect mystery cults.
I don't talk too much about the cults, but they do have an interesting history here, with kind of like the development of new religious ideas, right?
That's right.
and that's also a fascinating idea about Hades, right? Yeah, that everybody just gets sent there, and you almost become kind of like a zombie
That's right.
type figure. It's
And
all. Do you think that's because the Greeks didn't have the idea of kind of like this daemon, or is it because that like so the Romans had advanced like the ideas a little bit further, or do you think that's just because the Greeks were their own kind of thing?
I mean, they're their own thing with their own history, but it comes into the Greek thought before the Roman thought. It comes
Mm-hmm.
in from the East. I think it
Mm-hmm.
comes in directly from Hinduism and this notion of reincarnation and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's and I wish I knew more about that kind of like the trans-regionalism of the I don't know the correct word for it perhaps, but like the globalization of certain religious customs, right? That seems like that'd be a really fascinating thing to know is how the Romans are not only being influenced by the Greeks and kind of the broader Mediterranean world, but like what sort of ideas are also being transposed from ancient China, ancient India,
Yeah.
because certainly those were big civilizations with their own,
Yeah.
texts and their own ideas about what the soul was and how to reach enlightenment. That'd be really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, you get movement of peoples, people
Mm-hmm.
conquering other people,
Mm-hmm.
people adapting customs, and you get this kind of slow dissemination, I guess, of
Mm-hmm.
ideas as well as culture and everything else.
And that's also one of those things that I think is often left unsaid when you might go to church or something, but that is that Christianity and other religions they're not a standalone religion, but they are sometimes like a point of culmination, right? They've taken everything that comes before them and then put it all together
That's right.
into one bowl, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of the Eucharist is a direct
Mm-hmm.
borrowing from the mystery cults and their practices. Except, think about how amazing it
Mm-hmm.
would be if you went in to take communion and you were taking like psilocybin, right? Because that's what it was.
Yeah,
They were taking hardcore
like
drugs.
mushrooms. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. And well, also the idea of the Christian concept of the Trinity, right? That there's the God, the Father, and the Holy Spirit. And so the Holy Spirit is this idea of like almost like a diamond, right? Like a something that
Yeah.
that affects each of us, in a way, and we can feel the tug. If you believe in like the Christian, philosophy that we all have our own soul and that we feel the tug from the Holy Spirit, right? And so we're all kind of like interconnected in that way. And to me, that's like a very that has like Roman and Greek kind of backgrounds, right, or heritage.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about gender for a second,
Okay.
because women are basically not in this book, and I think that's really interesting because these old school societies tended to be very patriarchal. And I wondered if you had any, are there like Stoic writers that were women, or is there any sort like how do you view gender like when it comes to Roman philosophy or perhaps like the ancient philosophers?
So this is this is a complicated topic, and this is something that a lot of the ancient writers get booed on or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's obviously an unfortunate consequence of just the historical times, right? So
You're right. These are very
there's
patriarchal, male-driven
that's right.
societies.
So there's not a lot of opportunities for women
Yeah.
to be writing, just because of the situation that they're in. It's not that.
Well, and there's
So I will
even
say a couple. Go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, there's even kind of like what to our modern eyes, what would just be casual misogyny in some of these texts, right? Like when at one point in the book, Marcus Aurelius is describing negative character traits, and he says someone with a womanish character would be seen as like weaker or not strong, and I think, or at least having negative attributes. And so I think clearly there's it shows that patriarchy in action.
So again, I'm not a super expert at some of this stuff, right? So
Sure.
but I think that I remember in reading it, especially in the Epictetus, right,
Mm-hmm.
that there are women practitioners
Mm-hmm.
of Stoicism. Like, so in the practice, there's because there were like sort of schools or like
Right.
groups would form, right?
Mhm.
Kind of like early Christianity.
Right.
So it was very ecumenical in that sense and universal, that they would accept Christians. I mean, if they accepted slaves, so or sorry, Christians,
And there were some
they
philosophers
accepted
that
women.
taught to women as well.
Yes,
Right? Yeah.
absolutely. So they would accept women, they would accept slaves. So that's that. I mean, and I also say, Plato is probably recognized as one of the first feminists.
Mm-hmm.
because he's one of the first people, like in the Republic, to say that women are equal to men.
Mm-hmm.
So that women, the golds of the Republic, the guardians, the women are equal to men. They both share in all the military duties, right? The women wrestle with the men. He says specifically, like, and if you sit there and chuckle at them because they're naked, right? They're gonna.
As I chuckle at them.
Yeah, they're gonna beat you in the wrestling match. Like,
Right,
you
for
can
sure.
laugh at them, but then when it comes to wrestling, they're gonna beat you. Right?
Yeah, for sure.
They get on the horses, they fight with the men. So it is. I mean, he's got this spirit of like equality and communism. That's. He's also, I guess, the first communist too. But
it's interesting because, you would think then that these ancient societies, being very like patriarchal, being very in a lot of ways militaristic, that they would.
Let me just say it depends on what society you're talking about. So
Sure.
Athens was very much patriarchal.
Yes.
Sparta, because all the men were in the military and off fighting, the women were equal to men in that society.
That's right.
They ran businesses and all kinds of other stuff.
Particularly because men were away at war all the time, and
That's
so women had to take those roles. It's very similar to like what happened in World War II in the United States.
That's right.
Right, that men go away to war, women start working in the war industry, and then after the fact, they're like, we want jobs. Essentially, happened after World War I too. That women got the right to vote immediately after World War I. Because they had participated in the war industries, and they were like, we deserve a say, in the political process. But what's fascinating to me is that there's this, and I think that every ancient society, some more than others, right? Sparta being, I think, a key one, have more militarism than, that they're very militaristic societies. And so you would think that the masculinity of that era would be what we would look at as toxic, right? Toxic masculinity. But Marcus Aurelius has a really interesting way of defining masculinity in this book. And this is a lengthy quote, but bear with me. He says, "And let this truth be present to you in the excitement of anger, that to be moved by passion is not manly, but that mildness and gentleness, as long as they are agreeable to human nature, so also are they more manly. And he who possesses these qualities possess strength, nerve, courage, and not the man who is subject to fits of passion and discontent." And I think it's interesting that Marcus Aurelius is using the terms mildness and gentleness to describe manliness. Those are terms that you would not hear in our modern context described, I think, as manly attributes.
Yeah, well, yeah, and it sounds, because that anger, right? That anger is just another passion, just like sadness or anything else. That's kind of knocking you off course of remembering who and what you are.
Yeah, it comes back to that idea of kind of like know thyself, right?
That's right.
Yeah, that if you're getting angry about something, it's probably not worth your time, right? And it's just knocking you off course, so to speak.
Yeah.
It's interesting because we were talking about Marcus Aurelius's whether or not he was kind of not a hypocrite, but condescending perhaps, because he was like he's the king, and so he's telling people to be happy with your lot in life. But he goes even further by telling people to kind of have this like fealty to the state, and I'm not sure if this is just a Roman thing, or if this was like perhaps like just all, or if it was because he was the emperor and thus wanted people to be loyal to him. So maybe you can kind of extrapolate on this because you've read other Stoics. He says that which does no harm to the state does no harm to the citizen. And so basically saying like that. And he goes further in another case and says that he who flies from his master is a runaway, but the law is master, and he who breaks the law is a runaway. And so it's this like almost like what we would look at as like law and order type of mentality. What's your read on that? Is this Stoics or is this just Marcus Aurelius?
Well, I feel like that there's a kind of another tension here. So in one way, this Stoicism seems like a very anti-revolutionary philosophy, right? They're not trying to like go out and
change things,
political change, right? So, right, the politics stuff is something that's out of your control. And you just focus on what you have control, which is your own behavior in the face of this. On the other hand, they tend to think of reason as a kind of universal law, and so they have this notion of us as citizens of a cosmos or cosmopolitanism,
right? Sure.
right, that we're all, regardless of whether we're French or Italian or Athenian or Spartan, right, we're all citizens of the universal community
Right, like there's
for
this
believing.
interconnected nature of humanity.
That's right, and he even says in there, right, that means you have this kind of social duty, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in here, at least, it almost sounds like Stoicism does imply this kind of political action, or like
Mm-hmm.
that ideally, you know, the people in power, or if you were a Stoic, you would form this political association that was as close to this ideal as possible. What,
Mm-hmm.
it's very similar to what Kant ends up calling the kingdom of ends, right? This citizenry that's universal, that's transnational, of rational entities.
Hmm.
So I suppose it would include rational aliens as well.
That's really interesting, though. Yeah, like, and I wonder if that's a product of Marcus Aurelius being the emperor, right? I mean, he clearly has a vested interest in not having revolutions,
Yeah.
and I would be interested to see if other Stoic writers had that same kind of law and order mentality, and it seems like they might, just because of the idea of not wanting, like you said, it's an anti-revolutionary ideology, right? That instead of, if something is bothering you, rather than seeking change, just accept it, because it might cause you more grief trying to change it. And so in a way, yeah, it is like an almost like a very conservative ideology, and I don't mean that term politically, but more so just an idea of like, not, my dad would put it this way, like, don't sweat the small stuff, right? Just kind of like take what is given to you and just be happy with it, and thus don't advocate for change because it might cause more problems.
Yeah. I mean, I think that does sound right. I mean, from what I remember, in someone like Epictetus, who's a slave, right? He's not interested in necessarily the political.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Marcus Aurelius, because of who he is, he does have this kind of interesting political slant on it.
Mm-hmm. And I also think it's fascinating that he wrote all of this about accepting your lot in life and this sort of thing while he's away at war, right? Mm-hmm. So it's so fascinating to me that he's talking about these, finding inner peace while waging war against the Germanic tribes in the north.
Yeah.
And so there's like this tension there as well, that he's, and perhaps this is like the Romanism as a construct, meaning that the Romans are like, we're all interconnected, but if you're not part of this system, we will kind of go to war against you and spread our Roman culture through force. And I'm not sure what to make of that, but I think that there's this tension between this search for inner peace while also making war with each other. It's kind of like, not to get too modern and political with American politics, but the idea of like going to war for democracy.
Yeah.
It's like there's a tension there, isn't there?
Sure.
One of the last things and this is probably, I think, one of the biggest problems I have with Marcus Aurelius, aside from the fact that he's the emperor telling poor people to be happy with their lot in life, is that at a number of points in the book, he says, nothing happens to any man that he is not formed by nature to bear. Basically saying that like gods make you able to bear these problems in your life. And what do you make of that? Is that true?
I mean, I suppose it's true based on, like, if you interpret it through the lens of Stoicism, right? So, imagine these terrible things, like imagine something terrible happening, like, someone dying, or,
Mm-hmm.
Again, the Stoics are going to say, like, look, whether or not that's, whether or not you can get over that is based on your judgments, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
so, when you get cut, you say, oh my God, like, look,
Mm-hmm.
look, so terrible, right? This is all pain and confusion that's being caused by your mental state, the way
Mm-hmm.
you're judging the reality.
Mm-hmm.
Change the judgment, change the reality.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's their position, I think. And so, and it may sound heartless or coarse, but it's like someone dies and there's this tragedy. It's like they'll say, well, what? Why are you judging that this person should live forever or
Mm-hmm.
longer, right? No one ever guaranteed this.
Right.
You were never guaranteed this.
Right. Yeah, he has a lovely line at the end of the book where he says that someone might be upset and say that their life gets cut short, and they might be like, well, my life should be a 5-act play and it's only act 3. and Marcus Aurelius is basically like, well, some plays are only 3 acts.
That's right.
But I still have a problem with the idea that that everything is that people are made to bear any tragedy that befalls them, because there are certainly aspects of human society, I think, that people are not made to bear massive. I think coarse might be the right word to use there. And again, I think this idea illustrates Marcus Aurelius's privilege, in the sense that, like, this dude is not bearing any, or compared to most people, not bearing many hardships.
That's right. And it's hard to believe certain, I mean, like after the 20th century and after the Holocaust and things like that, it's harder to sort of understand certain statements like that. Like that there's, after, it's like post World War II, right?
Atomic weaponry, like genocides.
Right. The notion of what people can suffer in this kind of massive tragedy is like something that they couldn't have dreamt of.
Right. And I think that's,
for them to kind of say things like that.
And that's perhaps part of the problem of taking our modern, like, looking at history through our modern viewpoint. Like, that's one of the things that we have to be careful of as historians and scholars, is recognizing that they're writing at their time and they can't conceive of the mass, like, murders that we might see in the modern context. And I'm not talking about, like, shootings, but, like, nuclear bombs going off and killing just 90,000 people like that. Yeah. Like, that sort of... Yeah, so when we read this, you're like, but wait, what about, as you mentioned, the Holocaust? That was one of the first things that popped to my mind. And it's just like, are people made to bear these things? And it calls into question Marcus Aurelius's ideas. But I think you're right. That's us looking at it from our vantage point and not Marcus Aurelius's, right? And so it's always important to consider the context in which these books are written.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's and not only is it important to consider the context to understand how what they're saying could be true, I guess, but also just to, I mean, one of the things I love about history, and especially ancient philosophy and history, is that it allows you to, for a second, step outside of yourself, right? To step outside of your own perspective in your own box and see things from a different lens, and realize that, these people believed radically different things than you, and their life went fairly well, like, I mean, just as well as, it was just as effective as your life. And so, I mean, that's one of the things that I really like about history, is that it allows you to sort of step outside of your framework, step outside of your own box, and realize that there are other ways of doing things that work just as well as yours, and maybe even that they have something to teach your framework that you can incorporate things.
Absolutely. I mean, reading this book, you certainly get lessons, or at least, like, things that make you think, and you're like, well, maybe I could adopt this, and kind of bring this into my own personal life as a way of improving myself. It's in a way, I know he wrote this as kind of a way of putting his own thoughts on paper as a military leader at war, but at the same time, when you read this, it's almost like a self-help book. Like, Marcus Aurelius is writing this stuff to kind of encourage himself to be this way.
That's right. It's very much self-therapy.
I think that's really fascinating, and I think a lot of, myself included, can take a lot of the things that you read in these books and apply them to yourself, or at least use their ideas to kind of interrogate your own life.
That's right. And it is that kind of self-therapy. It's the care of the self, knowing what your self really is, care of the self, and practice. That this is very much a practice. That you're supposed to engage in and that every day provides you with an opportunity, whether it's just checking yourself, right? Like, can I change my judgment here? Am I causing myself more pain than I need to? That kind of thing.
Certainly, as a driver in Houston, Texas, we can all probably use a little less road rage, right?
That's right. Every time you step behind the wheel, it's an opportunity
to practice your Marcus Aurelius. Absolutely. Right. Just think about, like, is this thing vexing me, and should it?
That's right.
Don't get mad at the BMW in front of you.
He thinks that he's doing the good, right? He's pursuing his conception of the good.
Yeah.
He's confused radically about what that is.
No, that's true. That's really fascinating, though. I love that idea that, every time you step at your front door is a chance to practice your own kind of version of Stoicism. And I think they would encourage that, right? There's that you got to find, in a way, you got to find your own path and apply these things to yourself.
Absolutely.
That's cool. Well, hey man, thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. It was so fun. Thank you so much.
Again, Dr. Jacob Mills, everybody.
Bye.